Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining this Nebosh Diploma session. Today we begin Unit DI 1.1, which focuses on law application, enforcement, and wider influences. In this element, we set the foundation for understanding how health and safety law operates across different systems, why approaches differ internationally, and how these differences shape workplace standards and expectations.
Let's be clear on what success looks like for this element. By the end, you should be able to advise on the types of legislation likely to apply to an organization, how enforcement actions could apply, and why international influences matter, especially the International Labor Organization's conventions and recommendations. You should also be able to explain how non-governmental bodies and standards influence health and safety in organizations. Notice the word advise. This is higher-level thinking. It means you must interpret and apply concepts, not simply repeat definitions. We will also focus on how legislation promotes positive outcomes, the difference between goal setting and prescriptive legal models, and what happens when there is a failure of duty of care, including compensatory mechanisms. Before we compare legal systems, we need a working understanding of what law is. In this element, law is described as a system of rules enforced through social institutions to govern behavior. Law can come from different sources: legislatures through statutes, executives through regulations, or courts through binding precedent in common law systems. In health and safety, organizations carry legal obligations to prevent accidents and ill health. Many countries structure health and safety law through a principal act, supported by subordinate regulations. The example used in the course materials is the UK model, where an act establishes broad duties and supporting regulations set goals and standards for hazards and industries. The key message is, health and safety law creates enforceable expectations, and breaches can lead to sanctions. Now we move into socio-legal models, which is our way of understanding that health and safety law is not identical around the world. In many modern societies, workplace health and safety is treated as a normal expectation. However, the notes make it clear this is not the case globally. So in this section, we explore how different societies develop legal mechanisms to protect workers. Some societies develop detailed legal rules to control behavior. Others develop flexible legal standards that allow duty holders to decide how to achieve compliance. These differences can stem from culture, social norms, economic development, and the role the state chooses to play in regulating its citizens and industries. What we cover in socio-legal models. Here's our roadmap for this part. We cover 4 connected areas. First, the role, function, and limitations of legislation, what law can achieve, and where it falls short. Second, we define and compare goal-setting and prescriptive legal models. Third, we explore legal hierarchy, especially how state and federal layers of law can exist side by side in some countries. Finally, we connect law to real outcomes, how failures in duty of care led to loss events, and how societies respond through compensatory mechanisms such as compensation systems, reforms, and liability models. Let's define these clearly. The notes describe prescriptive legislation as a rigid code that tells those under its control what they must do, and sometimes how to do it. It is often slow to change because it is inflexible, and as industries evolve, the state may need to keep updating rules or creating more regulations. By contrast, goal-setting legislation focuses on achieving an outcome rather than specifying the method. A key concept associated with goal-setting systems is the use of language such as reasonably practicable, where organizations determine how to meet the required standard based on their own expertise, risk profile, and available controls. So the key difference is, prescriptive law controls through instruction, goal-setting law controls through outcomes and duty holder judgment. Let's use this table to bring the comparison to life. Prescriptive legislation tends to be easy to enforce because it's explicit: must, shall, should. It gives clarity to duty holders, but it can also constrain innovation and become bureaucratic. It may struggle to keep pace with new technology and industry change because the state has to keep updating the rules. Goal-setting legislation, on the other hand, is described as dynamic and not affected over time in the same way. It supports innovation, and it allows those with expertise to meet standards using their own methods. However, it can also be more ambiguous because it requires interpretation. So when you work in a goal-setting environment, competence and evidence matter, because you may need to justify that you did what was reasonably practicable to control risk. Now we step back and look at why laws differ in the first place. Legal history develops over many years to reflect the society it protects. The notes explain that systems may develop from social beliefs, cultural perspectives, religious codes, socialist models, or judicial precedent. We also see legal complexity grow when countries come together for economic benefit, creating federal or centralized standards that apply across regions, states, or member nations. The key lesson for health and safety professionals is that workplace protections and legal expectations are shaped by history and governance, so we must understand context before advising. This slide reinforces that several laws can coexist within the same country. Alongside federal law, there may be state or district laws. There can also be community-based legal systems that operate without political organization. For health and safety practice, this matters because duty holders may be subject to multiple layers of obligations. It also explains why multinational companies often rely on internal standards and management systems to ensure consistent performance when legal requirements differ across locations. This slide visually reminds us that rules governing behavior have deep historical roots. The practical point for us is that legal and moral frameworks influenced modern expectations of duty, responsibility, and harm prevention. Health and safety law, especially in many Western societies, developed significantly with industrialization and rising focus on individual rights. But globally, systems developed at different speeds and in different directions, which is why international practice requires adaptability and awareness. To simplify legal comparison, we group systems into families. The prominent Western families listed here are Romano-Germanic, common law, and socialist law. Romano-Germanic systems are based on codified written law. Common law is shaped heavily by judges through precedent. Socialist law is linked to state ideology and legislators expressing popular will. Why does this matter in health and safety? Because each legal family tends to produce different types of legal instruments, different enforcement styles, and different expectations for how duty holders demonstrate compliance. Non-Western legal systems. Here we recognize that many societies operate outside Western legal traditions. The examples provided include Muslim law, Hindu law, and Far East systems, each with different foundations and approaches to social order and conflict resolution. The practical lesson is this: not all protections are written in a dedicated health and safety statute. In some contexts, protections may be expressed through obligations, duties, contract, or mediation. As safety professionals, we must understand what mechanisms exist in the specific environment where work is performed. This slide reinforces the diversity of legal systems and why global organizations often create internal standards to achieve consistency. When legal protections vary, internal policies and management systems may become the most reliable mechanism for ensuring a consistent safety standard across multiple locations and legal jurisdictions. Now we explore the relationship between moral and legal rules. The key point here is that compliance is essential, but moral responsibility often goes beyond compliance. Many organizations choose to exceed minimum legal standards due to ethical expectations, stakeholder pressure, and professional responsibility. In health and safety, this is crucial because the goal is to prevent harm, not merely to avoid prosecution. A professional approach means understanding where law sets the minimum and where leadership and ethics demand more. This slide introduces how different states position themselves in regulating health and safety. The notes describe an activist state as protective and directive, often setting detailed standards and imposing penalties through criminal sanctions. This approach can lead to more prescriptive rules using explicit language such as must and should. In contrast, a reactivist state supports existing social practice and focuses on defining rules within which organizations can pursue goals, often enabling more adaptable goal-setting approaches. So the state's philosophy influences whether the legal system is rigid and detailed or flexible and outcome-based. Loss events and compensatory mechanisms. Even strong systems cannot always prevent harm. When accidents or ill health occur, societies respond through different compensation and liability models. This slide introduces the key terms: financial compensation, punitive damages, compensatory reform, and fault versus no-fault liability. In other words, we are now looking at how legal systems attempt to restore individuals and deter wrongdoing after a failure of duty of care. Financial compensation is described as restitution, payment intended to restore an aggrieved party for injury or loss. In many countries, this is handled through court awards or insurer settlements. Compensation can reflect loss of earnings or opportunity, and also pain and suffering. The notes emphasize that compensation mechanisms differ greatly across societies due to sociocultural differences, legal structures, and whether the process is court-based or handled through other forms, such as mediation or structured state schemes. Punitive damages go beyond compensation. They are an additional award above normal damages and are designed to achieve two outcomes: addressing broader impacts on the claimant and acting as a deterrent. The notes explain that punitive damages have been widely used in North America and can be significant enough to force corporate behavior change because of the financial consequences. The key learning point: different legal systems apply deterrence differently, which affects organizational risk exposure and decision-making. This slide covers compensatory reform, such as caps on non-economic damages. These reforms aim to limit awards for intangible harms, severe pain, emotional distress, disfigurement, or loss of enjoyment of life. The notes highlight why this is controversial. For some people, such as children, older individuals, or those not in paid employment, non-economic damages may be the only meaningful recognition of the injury itself, beyond medical bills and wage loss. Finally, we distinguish between fault and no-fault systems. In a fault-based system, an injured person often must show the defendant was at fault to receive compensation. In a no-fault system, compensation is paid without needing to prove fault, which can speed up support for injured persons and reduce legal conflict. The notes also indicate that support for no-fault approaches is growing in some reform discussions as a way of speeding up damages payments. For health and safety professionals, this matters because it changes the organization's legal exposure and influences how risk is managed and insured.